So today I have a great question for you guys. What if anxiety isn't a sign of weak faith, but actually a way to draw us closer to God and strengthen that relationship with Him? Let's keep watching.
Today, we are talking about anxiety, but we're talking about anxiety and the intersection of anxiety and faith. And I know there have been many clients that have come into my space that have brought this topic up that identify as Christians and have disclosed that they struggle with anxiety. And then I'm sure that you can probably attest to that too, that there have been clients that have shared that with you as well.
The question that I want to go over is how we can define anxiety from a psychological perspective and from a Bible perspective.
There's a difference. There is an absolute difference between what we in the psychology world refer to as anxiety and what the Bible refers to as anxiety. So the first scripture that kind of comes to mind is found in Philippians, and it says, be anxious for nothing, which there's so many things that I could even, I just that specific phrase makes me want to dissect it in so many ways. Because first of all, when you think about the phrase like be anxious for nothing, I mean, if we take it literally, is God really telling us to like worry about absolutely nothing? I mean, if that's the case, then like I wouldn't pay my mortgage, I wouldn't feed my dog, like I wouldn't wake up in the morning for work. No, right? That's not what it is that he is specifically saying. And so I think what happens is that people will read something and take it for face value without actually trying to understand what the scriptures are actually describing or explaining, or what the Lord is commanding. So when you look at that word anxious, I'm not going to actually pronounce it, but the Hebrew definition for that specific word anxious is concern or to care about. So that is very different than the clinical term for the clinical definition for anxiety, which is what we treat. The people that come into our office that meet the criteria for clinical anxiety, which can be so many things, right? Like that what falls under that is like, I mean, Stephany, right? So generalized anxiety disorder, social phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorders, so many different things. That is very, very different than what God is saying in that Philippian scripture, where he's telling us, don't concern yourself or care about the things that I'm here to kind of take care of, or like trust me that I'm going to do what I said I'm going to do, or that I'm going to meet your needs. And so that's saying like, don't be so concerned about every little thing, like there's a place for trust there. There's a place to trust in the Lord. I mean, that's what the relationship is all about between us and our Creator. And I think that's very different than clinical anxiety. And so that's why, sometimes when we talk to our clients and clients come into our space in a very private conversation and they're like, yeah, but my husband or my pastor or my church community, I mean, they're telling me like I should be anxious for nothing. So like I feel like I'm doing something bad for worrying about this stuff. It's like, whoa, we're talking about two very different things. And that's what I would say, or is like the difference between those two things is like, in biblical terms, when we're talking about anxiousness, we're talking about care and concern and worry about things that the Lord is saying, I've got it, versus the clinical definition, which, we might get into, but it's like, it's severe dysfunction of day-to-day life. I mean, very strong emotional and physiological responses to a perceived threat, essentially. So yeah, that's kind of how I would kind of describe it. What are your thoughts?
Yes, my thoughts are pretty much alike yours. Like for me, the big difference is like anxiety from a psychological perspective, it's like worrying for the future, worrying a lot for something that can take our minds out of it basically. So it's like it also has like a lot of physical symptoms for us, like people and our clients too. And for and the other side, like the anxiety from a biblical perspective, it goes more from the trust point, like feeling anxious for the future, but it's because sometimes we have a hard time like trusting the Lord and trusting his plans. So basically that's like my definition of this term and work in both perspectives. And basically, with this also comes the second question I have for us. So, this second question is why many Christians feel guilty or shameful of experiencing anxiety.
Yeah, we do see that a lot. I don't know if you, I'm sure you could probably speak on that too, where I love that a lot of people within the church have started to see our counseling rooms as very safe spaces. And so, but along with that has come, um, a lot of truthful conversations that have been held where people have begun to share that they haven't necessarily been received very well, unfortunately, in their like Christian circles. And they've been left feeling kind of like made to feel kind of shameful almost for feeling anxious. And it's because anxiety is almost perceived as a sin, because the idea behind it is if you are experiencing anxiety, then that means that there is a lack of trust or a lack of faith in what God can or will do for you. And I don't necessarily think that that's always the case. It's the way our minds work sometimes. And I mean, this is the way our brain works, right? There's so much coming at us at a constant basis that our mind just naturally like need to compartmentalize, need to categorize, need to stereotype and generalize. That's just the reality. We just need to make sense of everything. And so I think what happens in those moments is that people who are very like unfamiliar with mental health, specifically anxiety, they've never experienced it. They are unfamiliar with it. They don't have loved ones that have struggled or battled with that. It's hard for them to wrap their minds around it. So they've never studied it. They're not doing what we're doing now, which is to like educate themselves on it. And so they just kind of pull from what they've heard, maybe like previous generations say, or they get their information from, I don't know where they're getting that information from. And so they pass on misinformation, unfortunately, to their loved ones. And so people are left feeling like there must be something wrong with my spiritual walk if I'm still struggling with this worry and fear and I'm still having these panic attacks. It must be a spiritual problem. I must be spiritually broken somewhere. That, that might be the case maybe for some people, maybe, but that's not the case for everyone. Like we were talking about earlier, there are an infinite number of reasons why people experience anxiety. I mean, research has shown that there are genetic components to it. Some argue, some don't, but some argue that there might be some chemical imbalances there. There are definitely environmental factors that contribute to anxiety. And then there are some there's spiritual warfare. So there's spiritual elements that might contribute to anxiety. It may have nothing to do with trust and a lack of fear. You might be, for those of you that like, come from a faith background, somebody might be being spiritually attacked and are experiencing real threatening emotions, right? So I think sometimes what happens is these people that are experiencing anxiety get boxed into this like really tiny box and are told that it just might be a lack of trust or faith, and so that just they get all this like shame and guilt gets piled on top of them. And I think it's for lack of information, lack of education, lack of understanding, and misinformation just gets passed down, from generation to generation, from community to community, from church to church, from individual to individual. And I think it's really sad because it could impact people on an emotional level, a mental level, and even a very deep spiritual level. So I don't know. That's just kind of my some of my initial thoughts when it comes to like shame and guilt and kind of where it comes from.
So, what are maybe one or the most like common for you that comes to mind to tell
Mhm.
our clients or people that are watching us about one
Yeah.
of the tools?
Yeah. So there's so many things that come to mind that I've utilized either in my personal life or with clients over the years. It really does depend, I hate to give this broad answer. It does depend on the individual person and their specific situation. You and I both know that, like with counseling, individual treatment plans are key. Anytime that you're going to a counselor and they give you something that is very broad and very general, you want to run. You do not want to stay working with that provider. You want something that is very specific, and very tailored to your needs. So, I just want to put that out there. So it does depend on the person that we're working with, but there are a few things that come to mind when I think about, somebody that maybe has come to my office and has shared with me that they are struggling with anxiety, and also they identify as a Christian. One of the most common ones that comes to mind is like the interconnectedness or the combination of like CBT practices or the CBT approach, and then also just scripture. So when you think of CBT, right, there's the cognitive and the behavioral piece. And so the idea behind it is if we change the way that we think, so if we change our thoughts, if we change our negative thought patterns, then naturally that's going to change our behaviors.
Mhm.
And so the idea behind it from a Christian perspective is if we're able to replace some of our negative thinking, in this case, it would be our anxious thinking, with something that is a little bit more positive, a little bit more hopeful, then eventually that is going to lead to a more positive outcome, essentially. We would take whatever those anxious thoughts are, and then we would begin to see what exactly does the Bible say about that, or what are some um, more encouraging scriptures or verses that we can find that relate to that they might be able to recite, they might be able to meditate on, gain a deeper understanding of, that they can kind of like anchor themselves to, root themselves to, gain kind of a firmer foundation in, to help them kind of get through those more difficult moments. And we might suggest then, if we're using this kind of tool, we might suggest to someone that maybe they might think like God is my protector, which comes from Psalm 91. Somebody who does find peace in knowing that there is something greater out there than themselves, right? Then finds peace in knowing that although I might feel unsafe in this moment, I find peace in knowing that there is a God out there that is larger than me, who is out there, who is protecting me.
Mhm.
And so that would be, yeah, an example of like what we're talking about, a way to be able to take an anxious thought and replace it with something that is found in scripture.
I love that. I have another tool. So this is my own prayer journal. Normally, what I do is kind of write letters to God, depending on how I'm
Mm,
feeling. So it could go around like, Lord, I feel anxious about this problem. Help me trust you. Help me go through it, or give me the wisdom, guide me through X or Y
mm,
situation. And I have wrote, let's say, since last year, and sometimes I go back and read it, and I have seen how much I have grown in my faith too, and personally, but also like the things that God has done in my life as well, that He not only maybe took me out of certain situations, but also was faithful in others, like maybe blessed me so much that I was like, oh, at that time when I wrote that, I would never have imagined that I be leaving what I'm leaving right now, or I'm
uh,
experiencing right now. I love comparing those times with the present and seeing how faithful also God has been with me.
I personally, when I'm talking to clients about journaling, Christian clients, I'm telling them to do that, but then also sometimes I might have them read certain parts of the Bible that almost kind of for me jump out as journal entries. And for me, it's the book of Psalms. I feel like it's almost like we're getting a sneak peek of like David's journal entries as he's kind of walking through his own experiences, you know? So yeah, I think it's a phenomenal tool.
I love that because as being in a grounding technique, like when you incorporate more than one of your senses, it makes you be more aware. You want to incorporate at least two or three parts
Mhm,
of your senses. So I love that. I
mhm,
want to also piggyback on you mentioned about great King David and the Psalms. So with the Psalms, I want to tweak it a little bit in today's date and in land and worshiping and music, and how that's also very healing in a type of therapy too, because encourage just encourages us to listen and to be also attentive to the lyrics and like when I just want to worship, I'm like, okay, let me just have my Bible like or worshiping like modern version, and I
mhm.
can just jam it while I'm driving or when I'm exercising or just like, house duties too. And I love it. This is like another tool that our clients or people that watch us can also use. Like, hey, like worshiping is praying like David did, but it's praying, but in another way, like in a
Mhm.
musical or another type of way. And some people like me are maybe very driven into music. So it will be like a very nice tool to put in place as well.
There's something to be said about worship and music and praise. That is a form of expression that allows us to be able to connect with ourselves, with others in community and congregations as we're gathering in our places of worship, and then obviously with God. Um,
One last technique that I want to talk about, casting fears to God or casting our burdens to God. So I have a box, a box where it's like basically my prayer box, but I wanna also call it casting burdens exercise. Like I write a prayer, I close it up, I put a date, and then I put it in my box. And basically, you can also call it God's box because I just put it in trust that God is gonna work in this at His time. But at some point, I hope to take at least one of those papers and read it back and feel like, okay, God has work in this for me. So it's basically just placing my prayers and my worries to God and just trusting that He will do them. And then, also seeing how God has worked in my life with my prayers is nice to also see the faithfulness that He has, have for me as well. So it's just trusting God and putting those away. And I feel that you put your prayers in writing and do that exercise as journaling.
Yeah, I think it's such a great idea. Again, we're thinking about the ways that like mental health and Christianity kind of merge or cross. And I was just talking about like relaxation techniques. There's a certain type of breath work where we like inhale something and we exhale. So as we're inhaling, we're thinking of the anxiety, but then as we're exhaling, we might exhale like the word peace or something like that. And then very
Mhm.
similar to muscle relaxation techniques, we might, as we're releasing the tension in our muscles, we might visualize releasing the anxiety from our bodies, right? And so, as you were talking, I was like, oh, it's very similar to this idea of relaxation, but from a spiritual perspective, it's almost like you're surrendering, these things that you find yourself maybe anxious about, or worried about, or fearful of, or just you find yourself staying up late at night thinking about, and it's a visual of you kind of surrendering all of that to him and saying like, I'm trusting you to handle, these parts of it that I don't know what to do and I can't do, and it's not within my strength to do.
So that's a very good idea too, in combining breath work and meditation, but from
Mhm.
a Christian perspective. So I love that. And I want to invite all the people that watch us to keep reflecting in our reflection room.